So before we start that, you're going to think, why is a pediatrician talking about education? And so I'll give you a little bit of insight so you understand that I'm not too far from my field. Obviously, you know, a pediatrician gets to see how, you know, how children do, and if the education that was given to that child helped to raise a good human being. But more than that, my experience or my life was a very unique one. You see, I was born in New York City, and my mom was the child of educators, and my dad was a factory worker. They had come over from the Dominican Republic in the 1960s. You might have heard a story about my Aunt Peggy, but when they came over, my dad went to work at like a skirt company. He was the person who was pleating. You have nice pleated skirts back in the 1960s, 1970s, and even 1980s. He was in charge of the division that would make those very, very nice high-end pleated skirts. But my mom had come from a family of educators, and in fact, my mom's dad was a superintendent for a large region in the Dominican Republic. My mom's dad, my grandmother, was a headmistress for one of the larger schools in the interior of the Dominican Republic. My great aunt, so that's my grandmother's sister, was the person who wrote the curriculum for the public schools in the Dominican Republic, and it still has an award in her name for writing children's books. So this is the environment that my family was in until we got to New York. And in New York, I didn't know that this legacy existed. I was just a kid growing up in New York City, and I was just a regular kid. But life changed one day. You may know the history about the son of Sam, and they felt it was very unsafe to grow up in New York City. New York was very tumultuous in the 1970s, and so my mom and dad wanted to raise up my brother and I in a safer environment. So we went back to the Dominican Republic. At that point, I'm an American kid, because remember, teach your child in the way you should go. And so I felt I was American. I had already grown, you know, witnessed and experienced the bicentennial. I'm going to this country that, in my view, is not the United States. So it was a very big clash. It was difficult for me to adjust to it, and also adjust to that background where everybody is in education, and it's all about raising children, educating children. And my mom had decided that she wanted to bring back those roots of education that she had and start her own school. So she was starting a private school in the Dominican Republic with a curriculum that was, I would say, pretty regimented in how you taught a child how to read, write, and do math. And so here I am, between 13 and 14, I'm back in the Dominican Republic, learning to read and write Spanish because I could speak it, but I couldn't read and write it. And it was a very difficult time for a 13, 14-year-old. But I learned about education. You see, when my mom started her school, then it was important for the family to sort of unite together, and for me to be the person who was tutoring children after school for those that were lagging behind on learning how to read. And so that was my job. I got home from school, I had my lunch, I did some of my homework, and then I came downstairs into my mom's school, and I always had this little group of kids, and those were the ones that were lagging, and that will look like what we should have today. And so the extra concentration and focus went on those children, very patiently continuing to drill them on what they were lagging behind. And so I got to see how to teach a child how to read, and how to teach them their number facts, how to teach them a second language. I wound up from that having an English as a second language program that would teach them in 6 years how to speak English perfectly, and how to be bilingual, because you utilize the age of the child and developmental process to help the child to learn another language. So that's a lot of the background that I had. And so when I finally put the experience and the background base that I had together with pediatrics, it was like my whole understanding of how we build children really came together, so that I could understand why it was that we have such unhappy, uneducated children that are not fulfilling their potentials. And because a child is made up of a sort of a grouping. He's mind, soul, and spirit, or mind, what is it? Mind, body, and spirit. And we're not nurturing, we're not growing up and building each part of the child. And the education part is not quite as important as that heart, but I think it's pretty close to it. So, to build on the same thing that I was talking about, the child is a building, and you have to build the mind of a child like a building. And you have to understand, to really get the gist of it, you have to start understanding child development, so that you can understand that children don't learn like adults learn. They learn in a very unique God-made way, but they learn in layers. And so we can't understand why a child forgets things very easily, or why it is that we can't teach them something and make them deduct things. But see, children can't think critically. That's a thing that's sort of lost on education today. And so when we don't take advantage of these developmental milestones that the kids have, we are not feeding them the information at the right times. And it's not just that it's no good. It's more than no good. It's detrimental to the child's brain and to the child's psyche. And so that's what we're laying down in our children. It's a faulty foundation of education. And we're trying to take 4 or 5, 6-year-olds and forcing on them to think critically and to make decisions when their brain is not ready for that. If we don't teach them that first clearing of the ground, as I call it, of learning to pay attention, sit still, and have self-control, you're not going to get a child who's able to master that and then pay attention to the teacher and accept her authority. And so we're sending non-ready children to school. That's the first part that we need to do, is that that children need to understand that the voice of her mom, and therefore she confers her authority over to the teacher, that is paramount in that child's life. Once a child understands that, and understands, remember all those sitcoms where mom would say, "Come on, children, we're leaving," and they would, like little ducks, they'd all stand up and they'd all leave. But it was really, really, truly like that. And moms got to church, and they would sit in these 2 lines of the pews, and they would line up almost in size order, and they would sit the right way. No, they're not robots. Each one is unique and made in the image of God, and they're just so precious. But it was meant to be organized. And today we have anything but. I have a very dear mom who homeschools, and she has 4 children, and they're 6, 5, 3, and 1. That room is taken up by this family, and she and I cannot have a conversation because the children are everywhere and interrupting, and bless their hearts, they don't mean to do that, but I don't know how she's teaching all day. So one of the things, the first thing that I do when she comes in is I sort of stand or sit, and I look at the children and I say, "Guys," and I put my hands up, and all of them will look at me, and I said, "Okay, guys, get this. Dr. Stein has Dr. Stein rules." And I say it with a smile, and they all look at me, and I say, "Okay, eyes on me," and they all look at me. And I say, "Okay, so for right now, this is what I need you guys to do. Mom and I need to talk. And the rest of you will be very quiet. You can do other things that are quiet, but I need you to, right now, take your hand, put it right here," and I said, "You're going to zip the lips." And they go like this. And I said, "And take that zipper and throw it away." And they throw it away. And you've commanded, you've owned that room. And I said, "Guys, you're all looking at me, you're all hearing me, but I want you to remember if you guys are good, at the end of this time, you will each get 2 stickers. What is that we are getting? And the one that wasn't one, all the three others said 2 stickers. Very good, guys. So let's get on with this. Now, because mom's authority breaks down constantly, they forget that Dr. Rose was there and that they were supposed to follow that authority. So they had sort of a double message going on. But for the most part, those kids were well behaved during that time. We're not doing that at all. And that's that in a very loving, non-aggressive way. There was nothing aggressive about that. It was firm. The kids understood who was in command over the room. We don't do that at all, and we're not teaching our preschool teachers, our kindergarten teachers, our pre-K teachers to be able to impress that on the mind of a child, and because of that it carries on to all the levels of education. But that's where we start, and we used to be able to, kids line up, and they would line up beautifully in size order. We're going to the bathroom, and there will be no talking nor touching each other while we go in line, and we would march. The children would look up, and you know, that teacher was revered. I mean, it was like, if she came over and she patted you on the head and she said, "Very nicely done. I was watching you. You made me proud." It was like, whoa, the queen spoke to me. And we have lost that, where the adult in the room, the person who was our authority figure because our mother had given over her authority to that person, was the person that we really were paying attention to and we were following. And we have to bring that back. And women were strong. Women didn't melt down at everything, even when there were terrible things happened to us. And it's not to be stoic and not to just show not show yourself ever to your child and be like a robot. But we didn't break down at every moment because we understood that there were little eyes watching us all the time, and how we handle things, our children are going to handle it as well. So when our mothers and our grandmothers were very upset over something, there were many times they cried as much as we cry, I think, but they went into the room and they cried quietly and they prayed their prayers, and they weren't made of anything different. It's just that they handled things in a very different way, understanding that it is your job to make sure that the children look at you and mirror how they will handle life in the future. And so that's where we really start. We start by building moms, and then the moms build the children. And so that's the big fault that we have in our education system today. I can't remember what the next slide was after that. Okay, so foundation. And so after you have that foundation of building a child, okay, so this is pretty important. This is where I go into pediatrics a little bit, and developmental peds, is to outline the different things that children do at different ages. And so we know that a child, they have some variations in how they develop, but for the most part children develop in a certain way. And so we know that at the age of 2 to 5, when they're starting to go to all these preschools, and now we all know that there's studies that they want to say, but nobody has been able to prove any of these, that the younger the child is introduced to education, the better that they do. And so it's clearly been proven actually the opposite, that there's no documentation that there's any benefit to starting a child to read at an earlier age. The child is not ready. In fact, I read a study about Finland where they start teaching the children how to read at 7, and those children, by the time they're in 3rd grade, read much better than our children. I have a cousin who was the daughter of the person who owned my aunt who owned the school in the Dominican Republic. This girl could read completely fluidly. I mean, she was a child prodigy by the time she was 4 years of age, but she's no more intelligent or able to make decisions at the age of 44. It's not necessarily something that's helpful. It might be helpful to our self-esteem because I've raised a really smart kid and she's 4 and she's 5 and look how she's reading, but is that really what we're looking for? Or is it really the outcome? And so we're introducing reading to a young child when we should be introducing something else, and it really breaks down. And I could see that in my cousin Claudette, because her head grew very big. I mean, there were people all over the place trying to get her to read, and she had a lot of problems with authority and with organizational skills, because what she should have been learning as a 3- and 4-year-old, that time was dedicated to teaching her how to read, and the most valuable foundational things that she should have been learning were missed at that time. So we really need to be thinking about who we're actually building in the future, and that your thought of how that kid makes me feel good isn't necessarily good for that child's outcome. And so once that child gets to that magic age of around 6, remember, kindergarten was not required. It only has become required in the last, I think it's about 20 years. It might have been, or 30 years. It might have been during Jimmy Carter, but the last one sort of straggled in. But before the 1970s, let's say, school actually began in 1st grade, and knowing that the children had to be enrolled in school, that was first grade, and it's only in the latter part of the 20th century that all children have to be in kindergarten or in some sort of kindergarten program. But 1st grade through 3rd grade, what children are doing is they are learning how to read. And so what are they really learning? They are learning how to learn. And so you have to put that into them. It's a process, and it's a very deliberate process that takes a lot of drilling. That's why flashcards, that's why repetition is very important. But why is it so important? Because the kid likes repetition. And I'm not saying that, they thrive on it or anything, but they like it because they do it well. It's the easiest thing for them to drill. And they get bored, obviously, if you're teaching a child how to read and making him say, all the short sound, ab, ba, and all that. After a while, they get bored, but they understand it because they can do it. If we introduce that at another age group that's not between 5 and 7, they're not going to do it quite as well. Same thing for math facts. Don't try to explain the concept of 5 plus 7, and you might have more. Kids don't get it that way. You just 5 plus 7, that's 12, and it's a language to them. And it should always be just a language of math to them, and it should come out of their mouth almost, it's almost like they can't say it quickly enough because it just comes out. Same thing as rhymes. That's why we had nursery rhymes, because we were feeding the child's development. And so children, back even when I was a child, we knew all our nursery rhymes, we knew poems, and they didn't mean anything to us. We could say the Pledge of Allegiance and really have no idea what we were saying. But it's because the adults knew that they were feeding into our development what needed to be fed, and they were looking at the outcome. And so at some point, everything would sort of come together when you knew the Pledge of Allegiance and say, oh man, I really get that. That's really interesting. Or if he was saying the Constitution and it never meant anything, and then you're like, oh, I understand. Okay, the nation is together to ensure our securities, to secure us, and not necessarily to tell us what to do. And so then you're able to take all those words that you've memorized and put them together for them to mean something. And this is what that first part of the development of the child and education the child is supposed to do. It's supposed to not necessarily explain everything to them, but it's supposed to form that core of the child that he's going to draw from. And so I always get asked questions about Common Core, and a lot of you are homeschoolers, so you don't have to worry about Common Core too much, and we can talk about the too much later, but so that you understand that what really Common Core, I've analyzed Common Core and what it is, and what Common Core really is an educational system, and they're going to call it something else, so beware, but it's an educational system that does not build. So you are given a fact, and it stands on nothing. So it's like building a tent on the sand. And you're supposed to just regurgitate that fact, and there's nothing else. And you know that because kids can read. They sometimes can absorb it, but if they see it again, especially that's why we went to multiple choice. That wasn't necessarily helpful for a child. But they see it again, and they know that was the right answer. But do you really have a knowledge fact, and can you build from that? And can you make logical decisions based on just facts that you keep on cramming into a child's brain? And so that's what Common Core really is. It's not having sort of an educational base that doesn't build on the true foundational way that a child is built. And so, one of the biggest problems that I see with Common Core is that it almost never matches the child development. So it's trying to get the child to think critically when they're not able to, and that they think very, very concretely. It's like when you say a word that means two things, and the kid just like, what do you mean about that? And I could tell you 100 times that you just look at a kid and you crack up, because they just look at the things like exactly that. You know, oh, he was just sitting there all day. Really? He just sat there all day? He never left his seat? And you're like, no, it's an expression. They don't understand expressions. They don't necessarily get that. But they have an imagination where they think that what they're thinking in their head is a reality, and we're really just not understanding how children think, and how children. We could say that many of our children don't think, but how children develop. And so, just once again to go through the developmental stages. So in 1 to 2, this is what children can learn. They can learn how to be potty trained. They can start speech. They learn sounds. They understand simple commands. So it's very basic, obviously, but they're looking at you all the time. There's a famous video on YouTube. It was a little girl, and her parent was an EMT, I guess, and she would watch mom and dad perform CPR on the mannequin. And so she was alone in the room, and somebody was videotaping her. She went over. She's about 1 year of age, so she goes over and she's crawling over to the mannequin, and she goes over and she starts going boom, 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 boom on the mannequin's chest. Then she goes over and gives a puff to the mannequin. Then she goes back over and she's going like this. She doesn't even know that she is being videotaped, and she has no idea what she's doing. She just sees that mom and dad have done that, so she's repeating what she has seen. Well, someday she's going to be able to use that to be able to save somebody's life. So, you know, we have no idea what she was given that task at that point. But the thing is that children are repetition mimicking dynamos. That's what they do, the best of anything, and we are not taking advantage of that. And they do that, and that's why they learn how to speak so well between 1 and 2. And so they start speaking in sentences between 1, 2, and 3. They start following 2 directions where you start to be able to tell them, so do this and do that, and then you're supposed to get them to repeat it for me. And once you get them to repeat it, and you engage in their eyes, and you tell them, okay, and at the end, what do you say? They say, yes, ma'am. Then they have it, and it's almost as simple as that. But when they get to 3 and 4, they can actually understand some actions. If I do this, then that. So they're able to go to the next step. And they start following several directions. So you can give them chores when they're 3 and 4, which is unheard of today. And so between 4 and 5, they start really understanding the consequences. And so if we're not giving our children consequences for misbehaviors, then they don't think that there are consequences. And then they can also follow a series of directions. They make simple decisions. They have a sense of place. They start to understand some concepts, but they don't understand tri-dimensional world. They're not able to think in more abstract ways yet. So by 5 to 7 years, they start to really like patterns and solving problems, and that's why reading, think about it, reading is a puzzle. So each consonant has a sound, each vowel has a different set of sounds that they can do. And so if you put all the letters together with the right vowel and you put it in this way, then that makes this letter, this word, and then you put those words together, and wow! it's actually words, and I can read it and feel so proud of myself. And that sequence is very gives a lot of self-confidence to a child. And so that's why that 5 to 7 age is, I believe, the best age to start to teach a child how to read. But they also start to have better and better fine motor skills, and start to be able to, like I was telling you guys about my patient, start to build things that are a little bit more intricate. They have more complex thoughts, but mostly just concrete and not in the abstract. So if you give them a problem in the abstract, or you give them any sort of philosophical dilemma, they just sit there. And if you give them the answer, they know the answer, just like they're being fed the answer in schools today. They will know the answers to a certain degree, but they won't know why they came to that, because they can't. And so that's why it's very important that we understand, because I said so. It's very important for a child. You're not you're not being mean. It's just because I said so to them is like, okay. When they get to understand because I said so is a very important thing to mom. She said, okay. And between 7 and 9 years of age, they take what they're reading and they're forming thoughts, and they're thinking about something else, and they're relating to something else when they're reading this, and then they get, oh my goodness, when they start coming into the practice with their books and they tell me what they're reading and how that's important to them and how it's forming them, and that is just one of the nicest, the best ages, and they start becoming a little bit more conversational and being able to sort of, they're really detaching from their moms and dads and becoming individuals at that age, and they really start to read for enjoyment if they've been taught to read properly. And every child that's been taught to read properly, just about every child can read for enjoyment at around 8 years of age. So 50 years ago, it used to be that this slide was in the previous slide. So kids were sleeping through the night by the time they were 6 to 8 weeks of age. They were all toilet trained by the time they were 2 years of age, almost without exception. Even kids that had Down syndrome or some congenital defects were taught to potty train. They were able to sleep through the night. They were able to do things that our children that are sometimes 4, 5, and 6 are not able to do today. Children didn't need to be entertained. They went out and they didn't even need to have coloring books at church or something else to read. They sat there and they listened or made believe they listened or counted tiles like I did. But you figured out how to entertain yourself, how to get yourself to sleep. The act of self-comfort in a child and getting yourself back to sleep, monumental. If you can't self-comfort and you can't get yourself back to sleep, you cannot rest and you can't be okay the next day. And we're not doing any of those things with our kids today. And so what we're creating in our children is an environment of developmental delay. And so our kids that are 4 and 5 are really maybe around 2. Our kids that are 18 are really around 12 emotionally and in maturity and in experience-wise. And so our children are lagging about a 30%. If not more, in where they should be, and so all of the connections are being made in a delayed fashion. And this is happening across the board. It's happening in Christian families. It's happening in more secular families. It's happening in public school, homeschool. It's just because the environment has pushed us into thinking that that the child will tell us when it's time to throw away the passy, or when they're ready to potty train, and we're trying to pick up these very subliminal cues from our children on when it's the next time to get ahead with their development. And so what we've actually done, and this is a very passive thing on our, who knew that all this is happening, and we're just like, I'm trying to do the best I can, is we're impeding the child's development. And so we're taking things out of the child that really must be there, like cursive handwriting. One of the reasons we were doing that is it slows the child down. The child is on a motor. They're always going really fast. And cursive writing, if you think about it, when I write my charts, seeing the patient, sometimes that's a joy. I love being in the room and talking. When it gets hard, I have to come out and write. And we don't do things electronically, so we still write. And I have to slow myself down. I have to stop talking to everybody. I have to write. Same thing happens to that child. He has to exercise self-control. He has to write wonderfully. He has to be able to sort of hone himself in and write. And we're not giving that to children anymore. And we've really taken away one of the basic developmental important features of a child, which is to write in cursively by the time pretty much around third grade to fourth grade. They should have mastered it. And so they're no longer drilled math facts. There was a third grader yesterday who came in because she's having the difficulty in her grade level of third grade. Her mom's a teacher. Mom said, oh, she's not very good at math, but she's okay. She's sort of okay. But she's having problems with new concepts in math. And so here's a third grader, so she was 8, well, almost 9. And I said, Danielle, what's 5 plus 7? 12? Oh my. Okay, and this she's supposedly doing well, but we're not drilling it. I mean, like I said, math should be a language. I mean, it was even if it was 5 plus 7 or 5 times 7, you're thinking it in your head before you can say it. And so none of this is happening in our children today. And so math is truth. You can't get around 2 plus 2 is 4. No matter what language you speak, and you can see those numbers, and it can't be 3.5. And so that's truth. Math is truth. You cannot teach it as, well, you can do it this way, or you can do it that way, because that breaks down truth. And so the curriculums like Common Core and whatever I'm going to press that a lot when you hear me saying that. It's not that I'm repeating myself. It's just that there's going to be another name to the curriculums in the future. And so this one happens to be Common Core, but it's just not matching the development of our children. And it's asking them to perform things that they're not able to perform, which damages their self-confidence, but also is damaging their outcome, because we're trying to do something at an age where something else should have been put in there first. And so our children's wiring is going haywire. I believe that Common Core math and reading is probably adding to our ADHD. So I wanted to show you one of the books that is in a North Carolina curriculum. And North Carolina curriculum is not very different from many states. So you may have books like this and a curriculum that is similar. And this is a Common Core endorsed book. Well, first of all, if you look at that, I mean, don't we have good authors anymore? She doesn't really even speak English. It's Kiko Kasuza. We had to go to Japan to find her to write a book for our children that was going to be in the school system. And it's like, why is that? Okay. And so in that book, the children would read the book with the teacher. The teacher would, depending on the grade level, the teacher would read the book to the children, and then they had to analyze. Wait a minute, analyze. Children can't analyze. Why did you do that? You know? Huh? They don't know. You're asking them to analyze why they did an act that they weren't supposed to do. They don't know. We have to stop asking that question because they don't know. And we're asking these questions in a way that really is confusing them. Like, what does this book remind you of in your own life? Oh, I know that I went to the zoo and I saw a fox. That's what the book, and that's reality. That's a 6-year-old right there. That my granddad, he's a farmer and he has pigs. I went to the supermarket and they had pork. That's a 6 or 7-year-old, and you're asking him, what do you think about the characters and how, and which one was the one that you thought was the one that was going to come out well in the end. And so what they're doing today, you see, this time of year, are taking the kids in and having them stay after school and having tutors over them. So what they're teaching them to do is how to answer the question the right way. Not how to read and how to be able to build the blocks, but they're teaching them how to answer this, so they drill the right answer to the child again and again and again, hoping that 60 to 70% of this clicks, and the child can answer the question the right way, so that their results are adequate for that school system. And so here's the core of this, is that we're using an unproven, actually a failed method, and it's the block system. So you see, English is based on Greek and Latin, and both of those languages are phonetic languages. And there are languages that are not phonetic, and for example, Egyptian and Chinese, I think also the Japanese, no, Arabic I think is also a phonetic, but a lot of these languages were based phonetically. And so today our children are being taught with flashcards how to read. So we're not using flashcards in math, but we think that we have to use them in reading. So we give them a little word on a little square, and you flash them, and they're supposed to remember that. And that's the way that kids can see that, and they see it as a picture. It's like they don't really know how to read McDonald's. But when you take a 2-year-old and he points to McDonald's and he said McDonald's, and they might say something that was on the menu. Well, that's just recognition of a picture. And so some languages are that way, but in that language you have maybe a medium educated person has maybe about 2,000, 3,000 words that they can store, and after that, because they're not reading that much, they don't come in contact with that word that much, they don't have much more. So that's a different animal altogether. And then when you come to our language, English, then you can build and build and build, and there's no top to how many words you can keep in there, because you just keep on sounding the word out. You go back to the dictionary, you figure it out, and then you incorporate it. So it's you can't mix these two, and so children are having problems being able to, because now because the sight word system is failing so badly, and the kids are so behind. Now we're trying to mix both things in, and so we're creating even more of a havoc. And remember, in English and in most languages, we read from left to right. But when you read a sight word, you read the whole word, and you can read this way or this way the word. And so you're not sure, the eyes aren't sure if they're going to go this way or they're going to keep on going this way. And so that creates a lot of problems with dyslexia, and not comprehending what they're reading and not being able to follow the flow of the sentence. And so because kids lose about 30% of the words that they learn during the school year, they have instituted year-round school. So if you're an educator, or if you've seen these books, they're all based on sight words. So when you see these different levels, what it means is that they are following a certain list of words that, let's say, an early first grader is supposed to have. And so there may be 100 words in the first grouping. And so they know those 100 words, and they're very simple, and they could be found in, let's say, Cat in the Hat. Or Dick and Jane, whatever that was. And so they open the book, and it looks like the child can read, but what's really happening is that they are able to memorize all of these words that are being put together, but they're nonsense. It doesn't really mean anything. It doesn't build the child. And so they know those 100 words. Oh, great, you can read. And then you go to the next 200 words, and you get those 200 words, you store them in there, you make a picture in your mind, and the kid goes on to a book that has the 300 words, and then you keep on going. And that's how we're teaching our children how to read today. And so it's sort of sound, but mostly sight words. So that same girl that came in, who's the teacher's daughter, I gave her so how do you counter that? You counter that with a Noah Webster's reading primer. But I gave her Noah Webster's reading primer, which is what you're supposed to be, just for first grade. At the end of it, you're supposed to just be graduating from first grade. And so I gave her one, and there are biblical stories at the end. Remember, teach your child in the way he should go. So the first thing that you put into a child's brain is truth. And so I turned to the back, and I gave it to Danielle, and I said, okay, read for me. And she read with no intonation, because it had no meaning to her. And she was reading the story of Joseph, and how when they came over to Egypt, Joseph met Benjamin. She didn't even know how to sound that word out. And this is 3rd grade. And it's not by any fault of her own, nor of her mom, who's a teacher. And we just have to understand that we have to stop this. So, phonics versus sight words has been proven over and over. There's this really smart guy who made a great case. If you ever want to read about it, expound about it, you'll find it in Why Johnny Can't Read. He was laughed out of the education community, even though he was a really, really bright guy, because he said, this is ridiculous. We know that English language can't be learned by sight words, but we keep on using sight words. And so he went out and proved with study after study. And so I give this one about Raleigh and Durham because, you know, that's part of North Carolina. And I mean, you couldn't even compare it. When you use a phonetic system to teach a child how to read, they just are able to start running with reading by the time they're 7 and 8. And in fact, in Latin American countries, I'm not sure if they still do it the same way, but Spanish is a lot more phonetic than English is. In English, about 80% of your words, 75 to 80% of your words will be completely phonetic, and then the other 25%, you just you first sound them out, then you know, okay, this is a rule breaker. Well, in Spanish, you have almost no rule breakers. You have 99% of words just follow a phonetic rule. And so in Spanish, even the way that the consonants are introduced is very important, so that it flows. The first one is M, the next one is P. Interesting that the first one should be M like mama, and the second one should be P like papa. But it's very important, and you pick the next consonant, and then you keep on going, you keep on drilling, and that kid almost always, it's just very fluid, being able to read and being able to express themselves in what they're reading material by the time they're done with 1st grade. And so let's go back to the math curriculum and Common Core and how it's not teaching truth, and because our children are not being taught their math concepts. Why is 5 plus 7 12? Well, that's an absurd question. You can show them first, okay, this is what we're doing, and count out the balls, and that's it. Okay, it's just the way it is. You can't argue with these numbers. But when math becomes approximation, it becomes untruth, and so you're building an element of doubt, of truth in the child's brain, right from the beginning. This is very important to me, because this is in all of our schools. We think that all of learning has to be digitalized, and a lot of curriculum is even homeschool curriculum is on computers, but there's a problem with it, and medically there's a problem. We can get to that later, but really what's happening is that the way that you read digitally is not the same that you read in a book, and people read and remember things by textures, by sounds, by where a passage is in a book, and you'll notice this because if you read something and it's on a tablet, you'll tend to have less of an acute recollection of what you read, versus when you read it in the book and you can almost, there's an imagery that comes because you actually read it in a hard book. And so our children are remembering approximately 30% less at best than what they would if they're actually reading a book. So that's why I really like it when they're coming in and they're not necessarily reading on their tablets and they're reading on their books, because I know that what they're learning in their books will stick. So, and remember, as a pediatrician, we were saying up until just recently that we were limiting the screen time on our children to 1 to 2 hours a day. Now, the pediatricians, we got a whole bunch of backlash and said, well, you can't give us all that peer pressure. That's really bad, the parents were saying to the pediatricians. And so they said, well, maybe 3 to 4, and this is on top of the time that they're spending at school on the computer. And so even the pediatricians who knew this, we did, and we said we don't want a total of 1 to 2 hours of screen time. And screen time meant everything. So now we're becoming much more lax. And we also had said that we don't like for children to be introduced to electronics before it was 3 to 4 years of age. And now we're going back, well, we really can't, we don't know, we do know. Let me tell you a quick story about a little kid who came in for speech delay, and he was 3 years of age, and he could just mutter some things and he'd point to things. And what happened is, one, mom and dad work, so they're at different schedules. 2, he has 3 older sisters, and every time this cute little guy would point to something, they would get it for him. The third thing is that because they had such a messed up schedule, they would sit him in front of the TV, and he loved Teletubbies. And so the TV happened to be turned on in the room, and I was examining him, and I'm listening to him, and he's going, and he's looking at the TV. And I'm like, he speaks Teletubby. And it's like, that's amazing. So he was communicating, he thought he had a relationship going on with whatever Teletubby was on the TV. The kids don't, they remember, once again, they're concrete. They don't think like you and I are, that he's looking at a TV and it's a fictional character. I mean, they can't even say fictional character. But he had a relationship with this creature over there. I can relate to that because my mom let me watch Speed Racer when I was 4, and he was my boyfriend. So it's like, yeah, that makes all the sense in the world. And so we're not really relating a kid's development to what we're doing to them by exposing them to all of this iPad and electronic madness. Countries have outlawed the exposure to children to electronics. Wow, imagine that. And even the Huffington Post, if any of you follow along the left-wing liberal media, you would know that they are not conservative, and that they said that it's making our nuts. Everything it's saying is making our kids nuts. And yes, I see this all the time. And last but not least, so education builds a pyramid. And so the foundation, the clearing of the ground, the foundation, the walls, they come up to a pinnacle. The pinnacle is critical thought. And everything before is made to make this person who can think critically, make logical decisions, take their facts and say, no, that doesn't make sense. Or can say, yeah, you got it. Wow, I never put it together that way, but you're right. That's what our kids can't do at all. So give kids a series of things and have them make a decision, and they look at you like you are speaking Phoenician. Because in fact, you probably are. But the thing about it is we're trying to get our kids to think critically at 5 and 6 and 7. They can't do that until they're 14 and 50 at best. And of course, the fact that we're putting into their center, into their foundation, garbage, means that even if they could think critically, they're going to think wrong. And it's very important in our education system that we give them facts, not opinions. And what we're doing today is we're giving them opinions and not facts. And so kids will draw from the information that you give them to get to their conclusion as they're coming up, but they can't really analyze the accuracy of the information. So they don't see something that says climate, they'll see something that says because of climate change, the polar caps have decreased, and therefore the polar bears are now going into extinction. There's so many premises there that all they see is, oh, the poor polar bears, and they're so nice, and there are people that are bad, and it's making them happen. That's it. There were too many non-facts in the middle, but what they got to was the end, is that we're killing the polar bears. And so the incorrect information, the people have cars, all these cars are creating all of these fumes and these unnatural gases. That's creating climate change, which is melting the polar caps, which is killing off the polar bears and a whole bunch of species. That is so woven into them that you have great difficulty. It's not being mean when you have these kids and they think that gender is fluid and all of the stuff that we're seeing, and they fight back against you because you're trying to teach them something that's true, and you know that to be true, and they're fighting and they're aggressive. It's because you are challenging their worldview. That's their worldview, but that's not because of a bad thing. It's because that has been imprinted into them in the same way that that truth has been imprinted into you and I. And it is a very difficult thing to turn that upside down. And so Che Guevara is well known as being a terrorist in South America. We knew from the Dominican Republic this was a bad guy, not good. But you will see people walk around with a Che Guevara t-shirt and like, oh, he's good guy. They are teaching that in school. And you know what phrase they use is that one man's terrorist is another one's freedom fighter. Well, he was killing pregnant ladies, allowing his soldiers to rape and pillage for his own good and to create anarchy is nobody's good warrior. But it's being taught in our schools, and we had a young man who was a friend of the family who had this problem. He was a history major. He's actually doing a master's in history, and we happened to be talking with him about history, and the topic of Che Guevara came up. He got angry, very upset and aggressive, because he was being challenged on the thought that Che Guevara was not a good person. In fact, was quite the opposite. And this is what's happening with our children today. And I call that abusive. Not the young man at the end. I call it abusive when we're teaching them this in school, and we are creating people that don't understand how to think or don't know truth from non-truth. And so the last part is that when we do this to our children and we're teaching them things that are not facts, and we as parents know those not to be facts, once again we're disintegrating that maternal-child bond. How does that happen? Because the teacher is seen to be the expert in education. The mom is seen to be the person at the home that the child comes back to every day. And so there's a chasm there. What is being taught in school? What does the mom say is right and wrong? And the child sees the teacher as the expert. And so that destroys that bond. Plus, the mom can't teach the child basic things of like math, how to read properly, how to comprehend, because the mom is constantly told that she doesn't know how to do it anymore. In fact, moms are signing up for first grade math so that they understand how first grade math is done, so that they can then teach it to their child. And this is a new phenomenon, never before happened, that moms have to sign up for like college courses and school courses of special first grade math so that they can teach your kids. And so when you have something that's not truth, and it's being taught as truth, then you have a clash, and the child has to make a decision of who is it that's telling the truth, and it's a horrible place to put a child. And so that's why I'm going to repeat again, that texts have to be based in fact. And so for all of you that think that I'm keeping my kids out of public education and therefore I'm going to be okay, it's now they're trying to take our smarter children, even in homeschool and in private school, into middle colleges and early colleges so that they can put them in the community college system. And so the community college system, I was a trustee, sort of a board member of a community college, and so I got to see this working as it was being made and bringing in these children who are 13, 14, and 15 into the colleges. They are funded federally. They are not funded by the state. And so the curriculum is a federal curriculum. So even if your state has abolished Common Core, is abolishing Common Core is still going to be alive in this percentage of kids. But guess what? Those are the smartest kids, because those are the ones that are being pulled out to go into the early colleges, and they're being told, you get college credit. This is a great honor child. And so everybody's running over there because they don't have to go to the private school. They're pulling it out of the private school. Hannah's graduating class, about 20 to 30% of her kids went out so that they could go to the early college, and it's free. So you don't have to spend the $15,000, $20,000 a year on a private education anymore. And then you get this wonderful education, you get college credit to boot. And so it's going to save you from college. It's a farce, guys. Don't fall for it. GED classes. So when the best of the group, they take those away, but then they take the ones that didn't graduate from high school, because guess what? Once they get federal program, and so they have to be retrained in Common Core. That's why they took everything out of the schools and they put them into community college, and now everything is on the computer because it had to be all federally mandated. And so private school curriculum, we got this through Hannah. She's coming home and she's like, Common Core enriched. And I'm thinking, what? Enriched? That's like an oxymoron. Common Core and enriched. But you couldn't get it out of the private school curriculum because they get extra funding. And so private schools probably couldn't survive if it wasn't for this extra funding that's coming from, for us, it's like the Southern Association of Schools, SACS they call it. And so you have to be accredited through them, and to be able to be accredited, you have to follow this guideline, you have to adhere to certain curriculums, and so a lot of that curriculum is Common Core. So our kids, actually in Hannah's Christian private school, about 30 to 40% of our graduating class are progressive liberals. The last part is we are paying for our Bible, our churches to do VBS. The VBS material is Common Core. So we'll talk a little bit, very loosely, about climate change and about how to accept somebody no matter what. And yes, we accept them no matter what, but we are all made in the image of God, and God created us to be a girl or a boy, and not what you think of yourself to be. And all of this is being implanted right under our noses. So we think that homeschooling is protecting our children to an extent, because if we're not careful, they're going to demand that we are up to the same standards as the rest of the children, which would be really illogical. But that's we're not going to be able to perform well on our on our testing, because we don't know how to test like they test. And so our kids are going to look like they're failing when they're not failing, and guess what they're going to do? They're going to pull the same stunt they pulled in Germany and say, well, because those kids aren't smart enough, we're going to have to do a public school on everybody. And so Common Core is not about a different curriculum. It's about a failure of curriculum. And it's not about just brainwashing and indoctrination. It's about Common Core not teaching our children truth and not matching up to the child's development. So, like I'd said before, we went from being number 1 to number 22 out of 23 industrialized nation. And just keep on going, because I want to get to the end. Keep on going. Okay, so this is what works. Classical education. The Romans, the Greeks, they knew. They gave this kind of education so that the mind could think and you could become fluid in life. I was thinking about this today. Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, they were fluid. They were artists, they were scientists, they were thinkers. If you look, St. Augustine, St. Thomas of Aquinas, they would change what they were doing and their sort of their trade in life to an extent, because they were thinkers. They were able to sort of figure out where they needed to be, and they could mold themselves to that. We don't do that with our kids anymore. We build a plumber. We build a doctor. But it's a person that can't be fluid throughout society and be able to fit and match different things because they can't think. That's what classical education would do. And that was geared towards the first and ruling class back then. It's still happening today. Classical education is not being given to your children and mine. The kind of education, and that's what our founding fathers had put into our Constitution, not in education, but in being able to have access to the same kind of education that the Greeks and the Romans had. And that's how they attained the American dream. Okay, real quick. I'm going to try to do this in the two minutes that I have left. So first class, a ruling class. Second class, that's us, the working class. We pull the load for everything else, including the ruling class. Those people are just leechers on us, by the way. And the third class That's the dependent class. But guess what? You guys think that it's just the kids in maybe the neighborhoods that are forgotten and in inner city. That's not true. They're pulling out our children. They're pulling him out the time they say, oh, your kid's getting behind and he can't read well, and we're going to put him in a special needs class, and they never quite pick back up. They've targeted our children. And it's because they're special. They're like my little boy. They're special. He thinks very specially. But they have decided that he was not a good recipient of a good education, and they're going to build a tradesperson, hopefully, instead of building a person. And that's where the third class came in. And we've allowed that to happen with our own tax money, and we have to be guardians of our children's futures and stop this. Because every child deserves a first-class education. Did I get on time?
Sure.
Okay, very good.
Thank you.